Robert Logg was born on June 14, 1928, and was a retired textile businessman in San Francisco. Logg was initially brought up a Catholic and did not believe in anything of paranormal nature. Robert Logg decided to attend the lecture of Helen Wambach. Wambach was a founding and honorary member of the Association of Past Lives Regression Therapy and died in August 1986. After listening to Wambach, Logg decided to become part of one of her subjects. Whilst in a hypnotic state, Logg was able to speak foreign languages and could write hieroglyphics, but he had never learned or shown interest in languages or hieroglyphics in his life. Under hypnosis, Logg was able to recover 14 former lives that contained many details of historically accurate accounts that would not have been available to any ordinary layperson. In many of his lives, historians were able to authenticate his experiences. The first life he recalled took place as a high priest in Egypt around 2000 BCE, where his duty was to expand trade routes and look after trade relations between tribes and races. Some of the tribes he discussed were the Kawakanish, the Assyrians, and the Phoenicians. Logg was able to describe in detail their clothing, along with the various artifacts they used in their lifetime, where various experts claimed he was correct. His second life again took place in Egypt around 1300 BCE, where he was the driver of a grain cart. His job was to transport grain to the central granary in Egypt. He had a young wife who he was extremely attached to, and they lived in a small adobe house. Unfortunately, she was attacked and killed by wild dogs when she was bringing home some meat. For the remainder of his life, he grieved her loss and remained single and lonely. In his third life, he was now a woman. This life was again in Egypt, around 400 BCE. She was married to someone of a higher caste and was involved in the social machinations in the palace. In this life, she was very cold and materialistic. In this life, both as a married woman and then as a widow, she was occupied with schemes that would enrich her family by taking anything she could from the royal family. In his fourth life, he was a Jewish man who was a cheese trader in western Lebanon. He was a rich trader that made cheese from goat's milk and would sell them to traders who passed through his small village. He was extremely interested in the Jewish religion, and because his village had no rabbi, his father had become an informal rabbi who counseled other villagers. He was happy and content in this life. He had a wife and 5 children who he was very fond of and paid particular attention to his disabled son. Fortunately, he lived to be a very old man. In his 5th life, he was an orphan boy in Greece around 100 AD. He became an attendant to a Roman governor of Greece and had an intimate relationship with him. He died very young without achieving anything in this particular life. His 6th life, he was a woman in Central America around 1300 AD. Her environment was extremely primitive and intermarriage between the small number of villages was strictly forbidden. At the age of 16, she was kidnapped in a raid by a neighbouring tribe and was married to one of its men. However, she was happy and went on to have several children and lived a contented life in the village. The village was made up of thatched houses that were built over a river. She would love to weave. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 28, along with everyone else, when an epidemic swept through their village. His 7th life was as a woman in Portugal in 1450 AD, and although this life was peaceful, she was poor and her life was very short. She was able to describe in detail the town square. She died after contracting an illness where she fell into a coma. She could not name the illness. His 8th life was as a nobleman in southern Naples around 1500 AD. He described this life as cold and unsatisfactory, and although he was wealthy, he had no real power and had very little to do. He despised the taxes and rivalries which were the curse of Italian noblemen of his day. He was vehemently opposed to the neighbouring dukes who levied taxes on him that they would use to finance their many wars. In one instant, he was asked to pay in either gold or personnel, so he chose to send 2 men rather than spend his gold. He only married for political reasons, and his relationship with his wife was one of convenience. He lived to be an old man, and nobody mourned him after his death. His ninth life was as a woman in Wales from 1590 to 1618. She fell in love with a Spanish seaman who had been shipwrecked nearby. She got pregnant and the sailor disappeared, and she suffered much stigma and hardship for carrying an illegitimate child. She died in childbirth and was both angry and afraid, as she feared she would go to hell. His 10th life was as a male French peasant who looked after millet fields. His only possession was a wooden spoon, which he took great care of. His 11th life was as a wealthy woolen businessman in England from 1715 to 1790. He was happily married with children and was so wealthy as a wool merchant that he was able to buy a house in London Square. He loved to travel to Scotland and France to buy raw wool and to sell his own goods. He worked till the age of 65 before handing his business over to his son. He denounced the war with the American colonists and that their cotton was hurting his business. He died at the age of 74. His 12th life was as a cotton gin engineer in Egypt from 1810 to 1870. He worked in a cotton mill looking after machinery. Many of the machines were imported from England. He had a wife who died young, leaving him with a son. His life was very busy in the cotton mill, and he died at the age of 60. His 13th life was as an orphan in England by the name of Job Weatherstone, and when he was young was looked after by an elderly woman. However, as he got older, he would hang around the London docks doing various odd jobs. When he was 14, he met the captain of a British Navy ship called HMS Dolphin. He travelled around the world with the captain, who treated him like a son. He loved life at sea and described one of the stops at a Southey island close to New Zealand, where he befriended a native chief. The ship's captain was interested in the myths and legends of the natives of the islands and was able to recount many stories. Out of most of the lives he had lived, this one was the most verifiable. Miss P.M. Blackett, Research Assistant, Department of Ships from the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, later verified that the British Navy did have a ship called the HMS Dolphin, which had sailed in the South Seas from 1836 to 1890 and was later sold as scrap in 1894. His 14th life was as a female in Baltimore, Maryland from 1900 to 1902. He was asked why she died so young, and he said it was because he felt he had chosen the wrong parents and his life would not have been very fruitful with them. All in all, Robert Logg had lived 5 lives as a female and 9 as a male. He said he had liked his life as a male more than as a female, and at times was reluctant to record his life as a female.